with a little bit of a background about me and Balance Bay. So Balance Bay is my business. It is an independent equine nutrition consulting company, so I am not affiliated with any feed or supplement brands. Like she mentioned, I have my master's degree in equine nutrition. What really or enticed me to pursue equine nutrition was my mare Piper, who's pictured here. Very easy keeper, had metabolic problems, and I was really frustrated that it seemed like whoever I turned to for guidance was just switching the brand of products I was feeding. So I thought there had to be a better way, and my research during my master's looked at how horses gain and deposit weight differently and then lose weight in various weight loss programs. I am also working on my PhD on a part-time basis with my thesis focusing on equine obesity and inflammation. So I want to start with a bit of a basic overview of equine nutrition, because if you can understand some of the basics, you can be well on your way to providing your horse a balanced diet without necessarily working with a nutritionist. So we're going to start with those basics, and then we're going to get into some of the more complicated types of horses that I frequently deal with. So our EMS horses, our seniors, and our easy keepers. So horses have 6 categories of nutrients that they require. We have water, carbs, fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. And so we have to be providing adequate amounts of those to our horses to have a balanced diet. And we feed our horses a variety of things. So in Ontario, specifically, most of their diet is often hay. We generally do not have enough pasture to maintain them on pasture strictly throughout the summer. And of course, we're feeding hay in the winter. We then, of course, have grains. We have our concentrates. We have our processed forages, hay cubes, pellets. We then have our supplements, which is a whole other topic on its own. But we're feeding many different things often. So this text here is the NRC nutrient requirements of horses. It was last published in 2007, so I will say it's slightly dated. However, this text is what tells us how much of every nutrient our horse requires to prevent deficiency symptoms and maintain a baseline health status. So, for example, this book would say, oh, if your horse is 500 kilograms and they're in light work, this is how much vitamin E they need on a daily basis. So when we're balancing a diet, those are the guidelines that it is based on. However, taking the numbers from that book, and then taking everything that we feed our horse, from the hay, the feed, and the supplements, it can be a little bit tough as a horse owner to say, okay, I'm confident that my program is meeting those requirements or not. It ends up being a lot of math. However, it doesn't have to be that complicated if we follow a few basic rules. So hay is almost always the majority of the diet. I want you to think about what your horse consumes on a daily basis and picture the amount of hay and the amount of concentrate that they're feeding. Oftentimes, or almost always, hopefully almost always, most of what they're consuming is forage. Whether that's hay, or maybe if you have a senior horse, we have some different fiber options. But if it's 90+% of the ration, it really is important that we know what's in our forage. So the only way to know nutritional content of hay is to test it. I will note it is not always practical to test your hay. There are situations where you're hoarding, it's a large facility, and the hay is changing sometimes every 2 weeks. There might be a new batch of hay. In those situations, it really is not practical to test the hay, and that's the reality. However, if you're getting hay, normally I say if you have one shipment that lasts you at least 3 months, at that point it really becomes practical to be testing every batch of hay. And so when we talk about the importance of testing hay, everyone always jumps to sugar content. I would say that's the most frequent thing I see. Horse owners who have metabolic horses are often very, very concerned about the sugar content. So in terms of safety, that is, I would say, number one for a metabolic guy, looking at the sugar content. However, the second piece that I like to bring up is fiber digestibility. So I saw this a lot last fall, actually, which was unfortunate, that I was getting an influx of calls from horse owners who were seeing a lot of impassion colic at their facilities. They were seeing a lot of horses lose a lot of weight. And 2024 wasn't a great hay season. A lot of the hay was harvested at a later maturity. which resulted in it being higher in indigestible fiber. And so testing our hay can actually also give us information on that before we start seeing issues like impaction colic. And we don't test hay to say, this hay is bad, it's got to go, because you have a barn full of it that you've purchased. We test hay to equip ourselves with the information to work with it and do better for our horses. So if your hay was really high indigestible fiber, we are just going to add a source of digestible fiber. Maybe we're going to increase salt in the ration to increase water intake and lessen that risk of impaction colic, for example. So with testing hay, the goal is that we're having continual optimized nutrition. So if your hay last year was 12% crude protein and your Easy Keeper was maintained on a vitamin mineral premix, so just vitamins and minerals were being supplemented to the horse, and they did really well, but all of a sudden your hay this year is 5% crude protein, well, we might switch that to a protein fortified ration balancer for the next year. So that overall, the overall protein in the ration has stayed the same, even though the amounts in our forage are changing. So these are nutrient graphs. So this just shows, this is a nutrient graph for a 500 kilogram horse in light work. The only thing that has changed between these two is I've used a different hay analysis. So as you can see, the graph on the left, the digestible energy, which is your calories, and the protein content, the crude protein content, are adequate. That horse's nutrient requirements are being met for those classes. However, if we swap the hay to the one on the right, we will end up seeing weight loss. Maybe the horse is going to struggle to maintain muscle. They might lose top line. So simply knowing that information and being to adjust how we're feeding our horse goes a really, really, really long way. So as a horse owner, there are a few pieces of information that I like to encourage you to collect in managing your horse's nutrition. So we've chatted a little bit about a hay analysis. I find the biggest barrier to horse owners getting a hay analysis done is that they just don't know how to, don't know where to send it. So I like to offer, I'm a huge advocate for testing hay. I think it's really important for a lot of horses. If you are interested in testing your hay but don't know how to do it, you can simply send me an email and request the hay testing instructions. And that way I'll send them the full instructions to you and you will be able to test your hay on your own. I do not charge for this. You get the instructions. Just send me hay testing instructions and your location so I know which lab to tell you to send that sample to. The other pieces are measurements. So body condition scoring is a really great skill to have as a horse owner. Equine Wealth actually has an online body condition scoring course. It's, I think, about 10 hours, do at your own pace. So that is an awesome course to do to learn more about it. And then we also use heart girth and body length measurements to estimate weight. Getting in the habit of taking these measurements on your horses on a regular basis is awesome for recognizing changes before they become severe. To get on a regular schedule, I normally recommend making farrier day measurement day. It's something in your horse's life that happens on a regular basis, in a regular interval. So if you're bringing your horse in for the farrier, take an updated body condition score, take an updated weight measurement, and then you do have that track on a regular schedule. And then the last thing is compile a list of what your horse is eating with the weights. A simple kitchen scale works great, but a scoop is not a measurement, an accurate measurement. So we want to know how much weight of a product a horse is consuming. So when we talk about choosing products for our horses, if you can navigate the feed store well, it is a great step in the right direction to balance nutrition for your horse. Would anyone like to volunteer reasons why they have chosen certain products for their horse, or how they go about choosing, yes, I'm going to add this supplement, or I'm going to switch my horse to this feed?
Age.
Age, yep.
Coat condition.
Coat condition. So mostly we're seeing like changes in our horses, which is enticing us to switch to a different product to better support them.
Weight loss or weight gain.
Weight loss, weight gain, yeah, for sure. So when we talk about navigating the feed store, I like to break things down into 4 basic categories of feed concentrate types. So the first category we're going to talk about is ration balancers and vitamin mineral premixes. So these products are designed to fill the nutritional gaps in hay. However, one of the main mistakes I see is that people will choose to feed a ration balancer that's fortified with protein, so say something like Purine Equalizer or Buckeye Growing Win, but they'll feed 200 grams, or like about 1 cup of it. And that is not nearly enough to meet the horse's vitamin and mineral requirements. So the feeding rate on these products ranges from about 200 grams if you're looking at just a vitamin mineral premix, up to about 1 kilogram if you're looking at one of the protein fortified ration balancers. The main decision between these 2 products, if you want to do a premix or a vitamin mineral supplement versus a ration balancer, comes down to the protein content of your hay. If you're in a situation where it's not practical to test your hay, I generally recommend going with the protein fortified ration balancer. As a visual, so you guys can understand amounts, this feed in this container is 2 pounds or about 900 grams. So this is the amount of concentrate you would need to be feeding to your average 500 kilogram horse in light work of a lot of those protein fortified ration balancers to meet the requirements. If you have an easy keeper that you are maintaining on a ration balancer, it's likely you're feeding less than this. So everyone's homework is to, if your horse is on a ration balancer, get a weight estimate on your horse, and then check the recommended feeding rate on the product you're feeding and make sure you're hitting that requirement. So after our ration balancers and vitamin mineral premixes, we have a very large category that's performance and lifestyle feeds. So these feeds, we had our just vitamins and minerals in our vitamin mineral supplements. Then we added protein for our ration balancers, so that increases the feeding rate because we dilute the vitamin mineral content on like a per gram basis by adding protein. The same thing happens with these because we're also adding carbohydrates and fats. So these products are really great for horses that have a higher nutritional requirement. So growing horses, senior horses, horses that are in a heavy workload, harder keepers. However, the feeding rate on these products is quite high generally. You're looking at normally about 2 to 5 kilograms for your average size horse. If you are feeding below that rate, and if you were to increase that concentrate product, it would cause unnecessary weight gain in your horse, or your horse just simply does not need that much of that product. It should be combined with a ration balancer or vitamin mineral premix. So if you are feeding a product that is meant to supply additional calories to the horse, look at the feeding rate. If you're below that recommended feeding rate, add a vitamin mineral product to your program. Just because these have been really fantastically designed by nutritionists, however, to be fed at that manufacturer's recommended rate. So if you're below that, your horse will almost certainly have vitamin and mineral deficiencies. The last category of commercial feeds is complete feeds. So we have our protein, carbs, fats, vitamin, minerals, but this also adds fiber. So in theory, these feeds could be fed as a sole ration. In the feeding rate, or like manufacturers' feeding recommendations, they will include instructions on how much should be fed if your horse is not consuming hay. We're generally using these for horses that have compromised dentition. I use these very frequently in horses with fecal water syndrome as well, or even horses maybe recovering from colic surgery. These products are pretty popular. Because they include the fiber portion, the recommended feeding rate on them to meet nutrient requirements is generally very, very high, like up to 12 kilos a day. In most situations, we are not feeding that much of these products because the horse doesn't need that much. So instead, we often rely on these as a fiber source. Add some digestible fiber, get a fiber source that we're soaking into the horse, some more water content. So just note that these products generally aren't something we should be relying on for balancing the ration. It's more so for adding digestible fiber. And speaking of fiber, the last thing to chat about in terms of commercial feeds is fiber sources. So almost every feed room I walk into has some sort of fiber source that is soaked and fed to the horses, whether that's hay cubes or hay pellets or beet pulp. I would like you to raise your hand if you have hay cubes or beet pulp or hay pellets in your feed room. Most people do. So these products are really fantastic for increasing water intake in the horses, adding digestible fiber. If you're using alfalfa, that can be a really awesome protein source, and additional calories as well. And I won't talk about supplements really, because that's a whole other topic and that could be a whole day on its own. But I do want to also mention salt. It's awesome that horses have a free choice access to salt, and that can be a salt lick. However, salt licks really weren't designed for horses. Horses have struggled to lick a salt lick enough and actually get enough salt off of that. So I always recommend feeding loose salt in their daily ration. Generally, an iodized salt works really well, which is just regular table salt. Unless you're feeding a kelp supplement, then it's not recommended to feed iodized salt. For your average size horse, about 1 to 2 tablespoons of loose salt a day is great for meeting their requirements. As workload increases and obviously weight increases, that requirement will go up. But add loose salt to their ration. It is so critical that we don't only rely on salt licks to meet their sodium needs. So this is the end of the basic nutrition portion. We're going to test our hay, we're going to collect that information, measure our horse regularly, and check our feeding rates on the products that we're relying on, because they are formulated by nutritionists to be fed at that specific rate. So I want to pause here for a moment and ask if anyone has questions about the basic nutrition portion. Yeah?
Isn't it true that much of the research that's done and the nutritional requirements is done on thoroughbreds?
Oh, that's a really good question. There is a lot of research done on thoroughbreds. However, I would say not exclusively, especially now that we're seeing a lot more research into like the metabolic space and easy keeper space. But yes, a lot of that research is based on thoroughbreds. I will also note that a lot of the research sometimes isn't even done on horses. It's estimated from other species. Like for example, in terms of protein, horses have a set of amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein that are essential and they require. However, we only have an established guideline for lysine, which is the first limiting amino acid. So there is a lot of science that we just don't have yet. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a difference between table salt and cobalt salt?
Yes, so the cobalt salt is normally iodized as well. It just also contains cobalt. In small amounts, if you can use that salt, it's fine. However, you do have to be a little bit careful of horses consuming too much cobalt because it can cause toxicity issues.
How much would too much be?
The only situation I've ever dealt with a cobalt toxicity, the horse was consuming one of the solid cobalt salt licks once a week, and that was causing issues. So I'm happy to look up the number for you on how much would be too much, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Yeah.
So there's a lot of research about iron overload in horses nowadays, and a lot of the processed feeds have iron added to them. Do you want to talk about that, Megan?
Yeah, scientifically, iron overload isn't something we have a lot of research on. I would say anecdotally, there is some information on excess iron and interactions with other minerals such as zinc, copper, and manganese. But we're lacking information on, for example, if your horse has a high iron water, what that would look like in their ration, or like in the ration impacting mineral absorption. In terms of iron content added to feeds, sometimes it's not even added, but iron will be listed on the guaranteed analysis because it is in there from other things, like monosodium phosphate, for example, is contributing to the overall iron content. So I'm generally not really concerned with iron content coming from commercial products. So now we're going to shift into some of our more specialty cases, EMS horses, easy keepers, and seniors. These are my two, I call them the balanced bays. Piper on the left, she's my very, very easy keeper who has previously had metabolic issues, and then my lovely senior guy Finnegan on the right, he has pretty advanced Cushing's disease and is 28. So I have a total soft spot for these classifications of horses. So equine metabolic syndrome is a health condition that impacts how the horse metabolizes sugars. But one thing I want to note is that not all overweight horses have EMS, and not all EMS horses are overweight. That's just something that I see maybe misunderstood sometimes. So when we are dealing with a horse with metabolic syndrome, it really takes a holistic approach. And first and foremost is the medical management. If you suspect your horse has metabolic issues, your first call needs to be the vet. We need to diagnose that animal, rule out other health issues, and your veterinarian just needs to be the one managing that. The feed and forage comes secondary. So that's what we're going to focus on today, obviously, is the feed aspect of it, because I'm not a vet, I cannot diagnose anything. We manage the feed after your vet has seen the animal. So when we're managing the nutrition of a horse with metabolic syndrome, we're basically trying to reduce that horse's glycemic response to the feed that they're eating. So in a normal horse, or a healthy horse, a horse will consume a meal that contains hydrolyzable carbohydrates. This means glucose is then entering the bloodstream. When the glucose enters the bloodstream, it signals the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin helps to signal the uptake of that glucose into the cells so that the horse can then use that glucose for energy. So in a healthy horse, the insulin is released. It then helps the glucose be uptaken into the cells for the horse. Of course, as the glucose is removed from the bloodstream, the level in the blood decreases, and the pancreas will then reduce the insulin secretion, and things return to baseline, essentially. And this is a very, very basic explanation of that. But when you have a horse with metabolic syndrome, that doesn't work as efficiently as it should. So whether or not the insulin just isn't signaling properly for the cells to uptake that glucose, the glucose isn't being removed from the bloodstream properly. Because of that, it maintains at a higher level, and the pancreas continues to secrete insulin. This is what really results in the horse having elevated blood insulin. And I know we're going to have that talk way more about this, but this is just like a basic breakdown of that. So this is a graph. This is an older study, so the study's from 1991, but it's just a good visual representation of what it looks like for a insulin spike in an EMS horse. So the horses in the study were diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, and after a meal, you can see their insulin level was higher and maintained higher than the healthy horses. So when we talk about managing the metabolic horse, we have to talk about types of sugar. So we have water-soluble carbohydrates, ethanol-soluble carbohydrates, and then starch as well is included. So non-structural carbohydrates, that NSC number that we most frequently talk about, is the calculation with water-soluble carbohydrates and starch. More recently, there has been talk around using ethanol-soluble carbohydrates instead. And the main difference between these two is that water-soluble carbs is your simple sugars, but it also includes your fructans. So fructans don't have that same immediate impact on blood glucose and insulin as simple sugars do. So that is why there's some information maybe supporting that we use ethanol-soluble.
What's a fructan?
So a fructan is, in terms of the fructans and where they're digested, so it is a carbohydrate, but it is digested, not enzymatically digested, I guess. So normally we're seeing that digested more towards the hind end of the horse, in the large intestine versus immediately in the small intestine. So because of that difference, it doesn't have that same immediate impact on the blood glucose rising, if that makes sense. There are a lot of online forums that say that we can just use ethanol-soluble carbs and starch solely, and we don't need to worry at all about fructans. However, Dr. Erica Macon from Texas A&M, I would say she is one of the leaders in equine metabolic syndrome research. She is still very much of the thought that we should be using water-soluble carbs and starch because some metabolic horses seem to react to fructans. So for my clients, I like to provide both calculations because there's information on both, and I just like to share that we don't really know yet, so let's take both calculations and just understand what those levels mean for the horse. So when we talk about hay for metabolic horses, the hay needs to be tested before your horse eats it. I can think of many situations that this didn't happen and it was detrimental to the horse, but one time I had someone reach out. They unfortunately had to euthanize their horse because their mare severely foundered. But she wanted the hay tested because she was confused at what had caused this limbic episode for her horse. So when I went and looked at the hay, it did not look rich. It was really mature, it was grassy, and she stated that she had been getting the same hay from the same farmer off of the same field for about 8 years. However, when that analysis came back, it was over 20% non-structural carbohydrates. It was very high starch and sugar, and obviously she lost her horse over it, which is terrible. And so testing our hay for metabolic horses, it really needs to be done before the horse ever consumes it because you cannot tell sugar content by looking at hay. So when we're calculating hay, just understand those different calculations and what they mean. I will also say looking at this, so if we use ethanol-soluble carbs and starch, we normally want below 10%. If we're using water-soluble carbs and starch, we say below 12% on a dry matter basis. However, these are guidelines, and they're guidelines without an extensive amount of research behind them. I deal with some horses that will have an episode if their hay is over 9% non-structural carbohydrates. There are metabolic horses that can handle 13%. So that's another aspect when you do get in the habit of testing your hay, you know what your horse does well on and what might cause them issues. So in terms of soaking hay, the research is all over the board on when we soak hay, how much sugar are we actually taking out. So studies have reported sugar losses of about 12 to 45% after 60 minutes and 30 to 48% after 12 hours. And so these numbers are taken from a variety of studies, and I can provide those citations if people are interested in reading more. But current recommendations are to soak for 1 hour in cold water or 30 minutes in warm water prior to it being fed to your horse. I do, for people that do have higher sugar hay and have very sensitive metabolic horses, we can also test your soak hay and see what that comes back at. It's just a little bit more finicky because that's a sample that really needs to get to the lab that day. It can't sit. However, the hay needs to be completely submerged. So it's far too frequent that I see like a muck bucket with a hay net stuck in it and they filled it with water, but half of the hay net is sticking at the top. Really, if we're effectively soaking hay, that entire hay net needs to be in the water, completely submerged, so you have to weigh it down with something. And then,
what about steaming the hay?
Oh, great question. Steaming the hay is really great for getting like allergens and dust out of the forage, but it's not as effective for reducing sugars.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're the same hay from the same farmer, but your horses go through it really fast, do you still have to get it tested, or like would it be useless at that point?
Normally I recommend that you still test it because if it's coming from different fields, it could be completely different. Sometimes there are farmers that will hold a specific batch and I'll go test. Normally my preference is if that's the case, I actually go to the hay supplier so I can get a representative sample of the lot of forage. But unless you can guarantee that that is coming from the same field and the same cut, I would be testing each batch still.
And since we're getting deep into hay, does the age of the hay make a difference? Like, a lot of these hay bales will sit there for, I don't know, 5-6 months as we go through the supply. So does that change the sugar content over time?
Generally not significantly. So normally what you're losing is you're losing a lot of vitamin content, but we really don't account for that, like much vitamin content in the forage anyways. We're getting that from our ration balancer, vitamin and mineral mixes.
Okay, great, thanks.
It's really, really, really important that the soap water goes down the drain.
Yes, that is another very good point.
You
Yeah.
can't soak your hay and then take it out, feed the horse and put some more hay back into the same bucket of water, because all the sugar's in the water.
Yeah.
You gotta put the sugars down the drain.
Yes, thank you for adding that. That is also very, very important for sugar. So talking about concentrates for metabolic horses, our guidelines for this have updated in the last couple of years with more recent research that has come out of Texas A&M. So previously we were relying on a similar guideline to forage. We were saying below 10% NSC means a concentrate is likely safe through my horse. This is dated now. We do not rely on that anymore. Instead, what we are relying on is the grams of non-structural carbohydrates per kilogram body weight per meal. So research-wise, it's been shown that when you have a metabolic horse, as long as you're feeding them a meal that is below 0.1 grams NSC per kilo body weight or per ideal kilo body weight per meal, they don't have an exaggerated insulin response. So relying on that 10% guideline is dated, because you can have a concentrate that is below 10% NSC, and you're still feeding it in a large enough quantity that is going to cause your horse an exaggerated insulin response. So this is just a piece of Dr. Erica Macon's AAEP paper from 2024, and that's how you calculate it. It's a pretty easy calculation. I also have an article that just summarizes our most recent research that we've seen on metabolic management that includes that calculation that I'm happy to send out for anyone that's interested. So relying on the percentage guideline for concentrates isn't really what we do anymore. So our checklist for metabolic horses is, of course, we're testing our hay and checking the sugar and starch content before it's being fed, soaking if needed, and then actually calculating our concentrates to make sure we're below that non-structural carbohydrate threshold. In terms of pasture, it depends on the horse. I personally feel that I cannot give any guidelines on whether pasture or not might be safe for your horse without seeing the pasture, understanding the whole history and where the horse is at, and everything that goes with it. So for pasture, I'm just going to say it depends. So I want to I'll pause there. Any questions specifically about metabolic before we move into equine obesity? Okay. So equine obesity is an epidemic, I would say. There are studies that estimate of upwards, depending on the population used in the study, upwards of 50% of horses are considered overconditioned or obese. Generally, we see about 30 to 50% being estimated depending on geographic location. The one piece of equine obesity that I think hasn't really sunk into our brains is that it is a welfare issue. You have exercise intolerance. It's been shown to have an increased prevalence of lipomas in the GI tract, poor thermoregulation, increased risk of insulin resistance, and systemic inflammation as well. So it's a serious welfare problem we have and continue to let our horses be obese. However, like I said, I have an easy keeper, so I sympathize with everyone trying to manage it because it's not easy. It's very difficult. So these two images are taken from the Equine Wealth Body Condition Scoring resources. So what I would like to present to you guys is why are we so concerned when a horse looks like the one on the left? This is a body condition score of 4, which is technically healthy. Normally between 4 and 6 we say is okay. We can see some ribs, but generally I'll see posts on social media about shaming other horse owners for having a horse that you can see a red outline on. Remind her that that's okay, versus this is a body condition score of 7, which is overconditioned, and no one bats an eye at that most of the time. We all think that looks great. Well, that horse would do so well in the hunter ring. So we need to adjust our perception slightly, I think, of body condition score when we're dealing with horses. So this is another reason why I highly recommend that equine golf course, to really familiarize yourself with the different body condition scores. And so this is based on the 9-point high-IQ system. And then I do also have, this is a lovely body condition score of 5, which I would say for most horses is what we want. When we talk about easy keepers, the biggest aspect that I see overlooked is the calorie content of the hay. So generally we see it range from about 1.9 to 2.3 mcals per kilo. If I use my personal balance weight data, just Ontario hay samples from 2024, which would be about 200 hay samples, the digestible energy or calorie content ranged from about 1.5 to 2.5 mcals per kilogram. Now I understand those numbers probably don't mean anything, so we've included a bit of an example. So if you have a 500 kilogram horse that is consuming 2% of their body weight in forage, say consuming about 10 kilograms, that lower end hay would be providing 15 mcals per day, and on the high end it would be 25 mcals per day. If you have an easy keeper that is not in work, on the bottom left, that horse requires 15.2 mcals per day of calories. So, realistically, if that horse is consuming the low-calorie forage, we probably don't even have to restrict it. They can consume that full 2% of their body weight and hopefully not become overweight because we're not oversupplying calories. If we have that same easy keeper and they're consuming the really rich hay, you're fighting an uphill battle. There's really no way to effectively or safely restrict that horse's hay to a point that you're going to elicit weight loss. So understanding the calorie content of your hay is so critical when you're managing an easy keeper. For my two, for example, those two horses have very different nutritional needs. Finn needs a lot of calories, Piper doesn't, but they have to live together, and so of course there are management constraints in any situation. And because of that, I opt for lower calorie hay, and then I supplement my older horse with digestible fiber and fat for calories. Because it would be really, really hard to maintain Piper and have her be happy and healthy and consuming her forage like she's supposed to if I had really rich hay. On the other side of things, for those who might have performance horses, if you have your performance horse, say, in heavy exercise, their requirement would be 26.6 mcals per day. If you're feeding low quality forage, the amount you're going to be investing in concentrates and hay cubes and fats and everything to have them maintain weight is significant, and oftentimes might even be hard for them to maintain optimal gut health if they're on such a low calorie forage and have such high calorie needs. On the other hand, if we're feeding that horse the really rich hay, maybe we just need a ration balancer, and that horse's calorie requirements might be able to be met with that. So calories is not something I see talked a lot about when we talk about hay, but it's so important. So for my checklist for the easy keeper, we really need to understand the calorie content of our forages. Choose your balancer based on your hay. If the protein's adequate in the hay, and for reference, so if you have a horse that's like in maintenance or light work, normally about 10% crude protein is okay. That increases with workload, or if your horse is lactating, for example, they would have a much higher crude protein requirement, but about 10% tends to be all right. In those cases, you can just use a vitamin and mineral supplement, but if your protein is below that, I normally do recommend going with the fortified ration balancer. And then the last thing is slow feeding. So slow feeding, there are so many options, and what works best for your management and your horse is unique. We can double up hay nets. We can add a grazing muzzle if we need to. We can add hay nets in multiple locations in their paddocks, so they have to walk around. We can, if you have rich hay and you can't change that hay, maybe we end up adding straw. If you're adding straw, I would recommend that you work with a nutritionist because there are some risks associated with that. So in those situations, I say you do want a nutritionist calculating that for you. But so many options. So if you have questions about slow feeding and different options of what might work for your horse, I'm happy to chat about it afterwards. So the last topic we're going to talk about is senior horses. So I want to start by saying that just because a horse is senior does not mean that they should be or can be maintained at a lesser body condition score. So this is just 2 examples. So this guy here, this is Finnegan, he's my horse, and he's 28 with Cushing's disease, and then this one here is Tiny, this is a client's horse. Tiny actually eats no hay anymore. Tiny doesn't have much teeth left at the age of 33, but as you can see, Tiny is still super capable of maintaining a healthy body condition when nutritionally supported.
What would be the body score on those horses?
I would say Finnegan is, they're both sitting close to a 5. Finnegan might be slightly below, and I would put Tiny at a 5. Its body condition scoring from a photo is really hard and not normally recommended. It normally has to be hands-on. I could, if you're interested, pull the body condition scores on those pictures. I would have the exact score for Finnegan that day as I took that picture to show body condition, and I just saw Tiny a few weeks ago, actually. But Tiny normally maintains right around a 5.
I'm just curious because to me, just from the picture, obviously not hanging on, he looks higher than a 5.
He looks higher than a 5 from the picture? Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, Finn normally sits between, I would say, like a 4.8 and like a 5.5. Right now, like going into winter, he's sitting at a 5. But yeah, that's why from the picture it can be hard to tell. And so when a horse is senior, it also doesn't mean they can't successfully gain weight. So this is a situation from a couple of years ago. This horse's name is Lady, and she came out of winter very underweight. And of course, the vet was contacted to rule out health issues first. And she did end up having some health issues that needed some medical management. However, then we needed to have a lot of weight gain. So her refeeding program over the summer, as you can see, she successfully gained weight. And I'm happy to say that even a few years later, Lady is still doing really well. I still deal with her and her owner quite frequently. And she has come back from this and is really healthy. So this is just an example that just because a horse is senior and has lost a lot of weight, doesn't mean they can't gain that weight back. And this is an example from this summer. So this was Rascal. Same thing. Rascal went through winter okay, but then lost a lot of weight in the spring very suddenly. Of course, the vet was contacted first to rule out health issues, and actually didn't find that anything health-wise was wrong with Rascal. We just needed more calorie support, and what we ended up figuring is that the hay quality changed and was much poorer than previously than what he was maintaining on through the winter, so we needed to supplement that. And this is, a few weeks ago, his owner sent me an update picture in October, and he is looking great going into winter. So if you have a senior horse that is on the lean side, don't be discouraged. We can often get their weight up and get them looking good. So we have a lot of physiological,
Sorry, that just called to mind, and this is kind of the time of year that we'll be thinking of deworming. Can you make a comment about that, because how that might be affecting both their condition and then what nutrition they're actually getting from their feed?
Yeah, definitely deworming is something that's really important. I personally don't manage that. That's up to the vet to be doing with the fecal egg counts, and making sure that you're using the correct dewormer. Just because I would say that's not an area of research that I stay super current on, and I don't see a lot of it. I'm not looking at those fecal egg count results normally, so it is important, and I will often say, hey, have you chatted with your vet about deworming? Or I always ask when the last time the horse was dewormed is and their last fecal egg count. But yeah, generally I would say that is mostly a vet question of when you should be deworming and having a fecal egg count done.
Okay, thanks.
So in terms of physiological changes for the senior horse. We often see compromised dentition. We know there's a decreased digestive efficiency, and there's a higher prevalence of PPID or equine Cushing's disease. With the nutrition focuses, we often focus on digestible fiber, a high-quality protein source, adequate calories, and those adequate calories we're often pulling from fat and fiber. So for digestible fiber, there are a lot of different options. For every horse, I could probably do 40 different rations with different products that all meet nutritional requirements and are going to work. So there's no one right way to do things, for sure. There are many different ways we can effectively feed a senior horse, or any horse. But for fiber-based concentrates, we have senior feeds, complete feeds, and our fat and fiber products. One thing I see frequently said is, oh, well, I don't want to give my horse too much grain. However, these products, like I said, are fiber-based. Oftentimes, some of the first ingredients are beet pulp or alfalfa meal. So just know that what you're feeding your horse, when you feed one of these concentrates, if you're feeding them, say, 2 kilograms of it in a day, well, don't feel like you're feeding them straight grain, because that's in reality not what it is at all. It is a fiber-based product most of the time, especially when we talk about senior feeds. There's also hay cubes and hay pellets or beet pulp, but just note that these are not fortified with vitamin mineral content. So they're generally not a balanced product that we're giving to a horse. Some of them, there are some options for hay cubes that have been balanced. However, same thing, we shouldn't be relying on those for vitamin mineral intake to meet requirements. So the next thing is quality proteins. When we talk about a quality protein source, it is something that provides essential amino acids. So generally lysine, methionine, and threonine. Higher quality products often also have essential amino acids added as just like straight ingredients. Amino acids are expensive feed ingredients, so this makes those products more costly. Alfalfa, soybean meal, whey, has even had some more research on it recently, are all really great protein sources for our horses. So, in theory, we could do a digestible fiber source, we could add a protein, we could add a ration balancer, we could add fat, mix that all together. However, with a senior feed, a nutritionist has already done work for you. And so that oftentimes is a really great option for horses that do need more condition and are older. So for adequate calories, fat is a big one that we rely on. Horses don't have a gallbladder, but they can digest and utilize fat quite efficiently as long as it is added to their ration slowly. So oils have become really, really popular. I'm not going to chat too much about the different omega-3 contents in the oils, but I'm happy to answer questions afterwards if you want, as I know that tends to be a bit of a hot topic. But if you're using an oil for calories, you can use canola oil, even though it is higher in omega-6s than omega-3s. Flax oil, cauliflower oil, or other good plant-based oils that you can use. Or, of course, if you want to invest a bit more and have a product that is fortified with DHA, which is the omega-3 we really want, that's an option too. Just for the senior horse, when we're relying on it for calories, it can get a bit costly that way. There are also many fat supplements: the Buckeye Ultimate Finish Line, Purina Pure Athlete, Brooks Flax Appeal. Many options to bump fat in the ration. So feeding a senior horse, I could have many, many different examples of different rations. These ones, I would say, are generally what I see more frequently, in that we have a few different things that we're relying on to feed our senior horse. My one word of caution with this is it can work, it totally can work. However, it's easy to miss nutrients. It's easy to undersupply vitamins and minerals, specifically. So if you are feeding a horse with, we've got our hay cubes for fiber and protein, then we have a fat fiber concentrate, we're adding to that for calories and digestible fiber. We of course have our loose salt, and then we're adding this for vitamin and mineral content. That's great, it works. However, no one's actually balanced that full ration for you unless you're working with a nutritionist. So that would be my one word of caution with that. But yeah, same thing, you could have a protein fortified ration balancer, beef pulp and oil, for example, to bump calories for a senior horse. That could work. However, senior feeds tend to be the better option because a qualified nutritionist has formulated that product for that purpose. So when we talk about feeding senior feeds, the feeding rate is so critical. If you have a horse that is senior and you're feeding below the recommended feeding rate, you do need to be adding a ration balancer for sure, or some sort of vitamin and mineral supplement. So to visualize what the feeding rate on these products looks like, generally it's about 500 grams per 100 kilograms of body weight. So for your average size horse, that's about 2.5 kilograms per day. So if we go back to, this is just shy of 1 kilogram of feed. So 2.5 of these per day minimum for a senior feed to be meeting vitamin and mineral requirements. This is a lot. However, that's the low end of the feeding rate generally. So just understand that these products are fiber-based. We can feed them in larger amounts safely. Of course, we're going to split the meal over multiple feedings per day. But understand that if you're feeding a senior feed and your horse needs more weight, don't be afraid to increase the amount to that recommended feeding rate. If you're still having problems with weight and your horse is not maintaining, at that point, definitely I would recommend working with a nutritionist. But understand that the feeding rate is there for a reason. That is how the products are formulated to provide a balanced ration to your horse. Yeah.
So when people are trying to do their own thing and they're, well, I'm not feeding tons of the senior feed, so I'm going to top it up with a vitamin, mineral, are there any risks of overdoing things?
You can definitely oversupply. However, what I see, I very, very rarely see issues with toxicity. Normally, almost every ration that I look at has a deficiency. It's maybe like 2 a month that I look at that don't. So generally, we're undersupplying vitamin and mineral content and salts to our horses. Oversupplying is going to cost you more money, but generally, we're not oversupplying to a point of toxicity.
So it's not a risk. They probably just pee it out if it's extra or whatever. Or?
There is risk, like for example, selenium. You can, I would say, that one more easily oversupply to a point that you are causing toxicity issues. However, it's something I see very, very rarely.
What do you consider a senior age?
That's a really great question. So normally, research-wise, I would say between like 15 and 20 is where they'll classify seniors. I personally would say put that at 20. However, when we're talking about a senior, we have to combine their age, their health, and like their health status and physiological changes that they have seen. You could have a 15-year-old horse that has lost a bunch of teeth and might need to be treated more like a senior horse. So I would say there's not one age that you need to be like, oh, I need to change my horse to a senior feed. The decision to change a horse to a senior feed comes down to if they need that digestible fiber, high quality protein, because they are getting less out of the forage instead of the age. You can have a 27-year-old horse that does great on a ration balancer and still eats hay very well. I see lots of that as well. So don't feel that like when they hit 20, you have to opt for a senior feed. So that's everything I have for you guys today. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I do also have a lot of educational articles on the website that you can read through and are free to access. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any more questions or chat with anyone afterwards.
We have a couple of minutes before our next speaker, so again, bathroom break. We know they're long. It's a long hour to sit and learn, so feel free to get another snack, take a hot minute, and then we'll get prepped for our next speaker, who's going to speak to the geriatric